Yeah, so let me sort of go back to the origins of the idea and what sort of inspired us to elaborate this critique, which is sort of, participating in anti-war movements, looking at, it's a bit before my time, but the anti-globalization movements in the late 90s, looking at then the Occupy Wall Street movements after the 2008 crisis, and sort of seeing that in every case you would have huge numbers of people and a huge sort of upswell of hope about how you could change the world, and yet in every single case nothing changed. So globalization proceeded apace, the Iraq War went ahead, and the after effects of the 2008 crisis was basically just in many ways a reconsolidation of neoliberalism, but also the rise of fascism. So the question for Alex and I was in many ways a matter of what is the left doing wrong? So what is going wrong here that despite a huge number of people, despite a huge amount of hope, and despite the system breaking down, why is the left not able to actually bring about any sort of significant change? And I think no matter what people think of, say, the folk politics idea as an answer, I think that question of what has gone wrong is absolutely essential to the left today. So our answer then becomes, well, it's what we call folk politics. And folk politics is a set of assumptions about the nature of politics today and about the way to do political action today. And it involves a set of assumptions that have been sort of theoretically elaborated over the past 20, 30 years, and that have then been put into practice in various organizations in the past 20 years. And these ideas are focused on immediacy. So this is sort of the core element of folk politics, is it focuses on spatial immediacy. So there's a lot of emphasis on local elements. There's a lot of emphasis, for instance, on, say, direct democracy, which involves people coming to a single space and actually talking to each other. It involves temporal immediacy. So there's a whole focus on the eruption of an event. There's a focus on building things for now rather than thinking about sort of the long-term sustainability of, say, a prefigurative movement. And then there's also a sort of conceptual immediacy in these things as well, which is focused, again, less on strategy, more on tactics. It's focused on direct democracy rather than sort of mediated forms of democracy. And the fundamental problem with these things is that they then lack the capacity to scale up to transform larger systems. Particularly with capitalism being a global system, is that building up a sort of local space separate from capitalism is insufficient to change the rest of the world. It's great to build a little commune and save yourself, but how does that help the rest of the world, particularly with ecological concerns and things like that? So our argument was that these assumptions had become increasingly taken for granted within the left, particularly in the Western left, and particularly in the sort of intellectual theorization of these movements. So you had a lot of talk about horizontalism, you had a lot of talk about direct democracy, and you had a lot of resistance to any sort of hierarchy or more verticalism or anything like that. So for us, this was sort of the core of the problem, was that going from the sort of very hierarchical, Stalinist leftist in the 1960s, you swing all the way to the opposite side towards these pure horizontal movements, and that then becomes a hindrance to thinking through proper political action and effective political action.
But I assume that you wouldn't reject the importance of horizontal and plural, more like direct democracy after the failure of Stalinist movement, or
exactly.
Or even in the West, the trade union was very hierarchical.
Yes, exactly. So the problem was, well, the answer wasn't then to go back to these old forms. Instead, it was to start thinking about different hybrid forms. In our manifesto for Accelerationist Politics, we talk about marrying the network with the plan. And it was sort of telling the responses to that idea, which was to say that this is a return to total verticalism, which is precisely what we weren't calling for. We were calling for more hybrid forms of organization. And I think, and I know this gets on to some future questions, but I think in many ways what we've seen since the failure of Occupy Wall Street amongst the left is experimentation with these more hybrid forms of organizing.
But one could say that, for example, like yesterday, the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez became the parliament member and came to Washington and so on. Or even more in the past, like Sanders' campaign was very successful in comparison to the past Democratic movement, or Sanders here. And then many people think that Sanders or Corbyn or AOC are actually, phenomena coming from the Occupy movement. But do you see it rather different way, or?
No, I think that's absolutely right. There's a fantastic book by Jonathan Smucker. He was one of the organizers in Occupy Wall Street, the New York one. And he looks at sort of different debates that are going on internally within Occupy Wall Street. And basically what you have is a group of people who are very much wedded to these horizontalist ideas and reject any sort of alternative way of doing things. And then you have people like Smucker who are arguing for something a bit more pragmatic, a bit more practical, and looking at how to be effective. And that starts, building connections with trade unions, building connections with other labor movements, and building things up with political parties as well. And I think what we've seen happen since, 2011 or so is that sort of group of people starting to build connections with more traditional political parties in many ways. So Sanders is a really good example. Alexandria Cortez is another great example. Podemos is another good example of this as well. So I don't think that's folk politics. That is people who have recognized the limits of folk politics and are starting to try and build something else.
So they're the hybrid ones, are you?
Yeah, many more of those.
Or no.
I think they're more hybrid than what we traditionally see.
But you want to push more hybrid way
yes.
in terms of
yes. So I think
more of which side?
I think if anything they've swung too much towards the party political side, the electoral side right now.
Okay.
I think this is a problem with Democratic Socialists of America to some degree and the Sanders campaign. I think it's also partly a problem with momentum in Corbyn here as well. And this is, it's not easy to build a hybrid organization. And there's always going to be sort of tensions pulling between different directions. But I think that is sort of the way forward.
Do you have some more concrete example of
so
hybrid forms?
let me give a really good example, which is Momentum, that I know fairly well here in the UK. There's different ways in which Momentum could operate. So Momentum emerged as a campaign support group for Corbyn in a leadership campaign for the Labour Party. So it was initially built to support Corbyn solely as a person, as a candidate. Now it's become much larger than that. And the question is, what is Momentum for now? So Momentum, there's a few things it could be. One could be just to support Corbyn again. So any attacks on Corbyn, that could be Momentum's job to sort of take on. Another thing could be to support Labour as a party. So this could mean when there's a general election, Momentum goes out and campaigns for Labour Party and tries to get votes for them. So those are two different things. And I think both of those are very oriented towards a party political, electoral, The third way is to not necessarily reject those other two things, but to also include more social movement things. So organizing local democracies in terms of trying to raise issues that are important to local people. So you've got different Momentum groups all around the country. They could be a hub to raise issues from the ground up. Another thing could be to organize what you traditionally had back in the early 20th century, sort of working class movements, which were far larger than just the political party. So it could be social clubs, it could be parties, it could be food banks, it could be, I know in the United States, for instance, Democratic Socialists of America, one of the things they do is they go out and fix headlights and taillights of cars so people aren't getting pulled over by the cops. And this is just a way of helping out with the local community in a way that isn't just the sort of campaign approach of every 4 or 5 years coming to the door and saying, vote for us. Instead of saying, we're going to help you with your everyday life. I think that's what Momentum needs to do more of. I think that's what Democratic Socialists of America need to do more of. And that, I think, is more of a more hybrid sort of form.
The Momentum has also the horizontal structure.
To some degree, yes.
So that's very interesting because, it's not just a Corbyn himself, it's winning the electoral politics and changing society, but there's a more
Yeah.
deepening of the social movement throughout society. But what about Corbyn himself? How do you like evaluate him? I mean, you're not like a politician, but or a political scientist, but how do you see him? So he's a little bit towards, well, like those people who support Corbyn are often towards too much of political side, like not engaging enough with the hybrid.
Yeah. Yes, I think broadly that's true. There's good people in momentum who are trying to build sort of hybrid things. Okay, so the good things about Corbyn would be that he's inspired a whole new group of people to be interested in this sort of politics. He's completely changed the political debate here in the UK. And I think he's created a whole lot of hope that things actually could get better.
Mm-hmm.
I think the problems are, again, the fact that Momentum, which could be a fantastic organization, is being drawn into very electoralist things. So I think that's one sort of limit of it. Another is often, the discussion here is often very leadership focused. So it's very much Corbyn as a person,
Right.
as a personality, as a leader, rather than thinking about, well, how could we use this moment to build the strength of the working class more broadly? And that sort of question doesn't get asked very often. I also think it's not sufficiently international. So there have been efforts by Corbyn to reach out to socialists across Europe, for instance, but these haven't really led to anything concrete. I mean, there's sort of vocal support for each other, but you have somebody like Steve Bannon explicitly trying to build an internationalist new right. And Corbyn isn't really doing anything to try and combat that sort of thing. You got something like Yanis Varoufakis trying to build an alternative one, and Sanders as well is involved. But I think Corbyn could be leading on that in a much more strong way. Mm-hmm. So not sufficiently international, it's often too leadership focused. The other thing is, and this is sort of a problem with Corbyn himself, is he is a more traditional left. That's sort of his fundamental constitution, is that he comes from what's known as the Bennite left here in the UK, which is quite against the EU. It does believe in sort of a socialism in one country is possible. And it's not sufficiently attuned, I think, to the realities of the changed world today. So he himself, I think, has some more traditional politics. That being said, I think somebody like John McDonnell, who is his shadow chancellor, I think is much more interested in what are the impacts of automation, what are the impacts of technology more broadly, how can we completely rechange the economy in order to address these things. McDonnell seems completely open to all those things.
Mm. So there are other people that can be more.
Yeah. And I know there's people working in the leadership group that are all very in tune with this stuff.
Mm. So the younger generation actually start going beyond the folk politics. That's you actually observe in reality. You see that some positive development.
Yeah.
Because one thing I really liked about the critique of folk politics is that I also understand that all the hierarchical structure is very problematic, but if you want to challenge the global capitalism, you can't really stay in a small scale local community politics.
Yeah.
And that's very Marxist, I would say. And many left-wing groups start questioning about the possibility of another economic system other than capitalism. So I really endorse your idea of post-capitalism, the inventing another society. So we can talk about post-capitalism, a world without war. Many people still, especially Japanese people, cannot really think about post-capitalism or another society without work. The Japanese people work so much, as everyone knows. So what is post-capitalism, and why do you think it is possible, or more possible than ever today?
So post-capitalism, for me, is in many ways a different term for communism or socialism. I think the reason why we didn't call it communism in a world without work is simply because when you claim that you're arguing for communism, it brings up bad memories for a lot of people, and it brings up a whole lot of baggage that the debate then gets winnowed down to basically, are you for gulags or against gulags? When actually the more interesting question is, what is the future society that we really want to see? And how is that possible on the basis of changing conditions today? So post-capitalism is a way to sort of get around all those questions and boring debates.
So to me, you can say it's actually communism.
It is communism. It absolutely is. But I think there's another key aspect of that post aspect, which is Marx saw communism as being something that happens after capitalism. Capitalism had to come along in order to build the conditions for a better society on the basis of it. And without those conditions, you wouldn't be able to build communism. And I think that goes against some strands of the left today, which think that you can build communism rather without any material conditions necessary for it. So this idea of possibly returning to a pre-capitalist idyllic society, which holds sway amongst some of the left, not necessarily a large group of the left, but some of the left.
Yeah.
And so I think post-capitalism also points to that fact that it has to go through capitalism. It's not a reversion from capitalism.
But why is it possible now if Soviet Union failed?
Yeah. So okay, this could be a huge. Let me put it somewhat simply, which is to say that the Soviet Union, when it came along, nobody knew how to build a communist economy, and it was very much an experimental and pragmatic thing about thinking about how do you organize a national economy, built largely on the experiences in World War I. So you get these war economies oriented towards organizing all of society towards the war effort. And then that gets continued on throughout the rest of the Soviet Union's history, except instead of being built towards wars, towards industrialization, rapid mass industrialization. And I won't go into the reasons of why that was maybe necessary at that point in time, but I think what's changed today is that the technologies for getting back to Marx's core idea of what communism was, which was the increase in free time. So Marx doesn't actually talk much about what he thinks communism will look like. He talks a lot about how capitalism builds the conditions for it and how capitalism has these tendencies towards crisis and everything, but in terms of what communism looks like, doesn't say much. What he does say, though, consistently, it's about free time and the ability for human potential to develop. It becomes quite individualist in the early manuscripts, and then it becomes a bit more collective towards the end. But it's all about the expansion of free time and the liberation of humans. So I think the question is, how can we reinscribe that vision today? And what we see happening is more and more technologies for automation arising, more and more potential for automation, particularly on the back of things like machine learning. So a whole series of tasks which have never been automatable before are suddenly becoming automatable, including, interestingly enough, a lot of management tasks. So the sort of hierarchy within businesses may be disappearing to some degree. But this is, I think what's changing today is that these technologies are emerging which are allowing us to imagine again, because it's not the first time we've thought about this, but imagine again a world with much less work. And polemically in the book we put it as a world without work. Mm-hmm. But of course, realistically speaking, there's always going to be some work that needs to be done.
But the view of necessity remains.
Yeah.
So the productivity becomes really high today.
Yeah. Well, it could. And this gets into some other debates about actually productivity doesn't seem to be rising all that much, despite all these new technologies.
Right. So that's a little bit about classical capitalism.
A little bit, yeah.
But I think many, for example, workers are afraid that robots and AI would take their jobs, and then, they have to do only simple jobs that are too costly for replacing them with robots, for example.
Yeah.
So maybe workers don't like it. or even like capitalists develop these technologies, right? Under the capitalism at least. So these developments of technologies can be used as a tool to dominate workers or to control more. So do you think that that can lead to the world without less work?
It can, but it involves increasing workers' power. So you're absolutely right that technologies generated by capitalists are not going to liberate us from work, not without a massive political struggle at the very least. There's numerous examples throughout history of situations where capitalists bring in technology that may have actually been more productive to choose one version, but instead they choose a version which allows them to control workers more. So the solution there is not to reject technology, it's instead to say, well, we need greater worker power to be able to actually insist and enforce the technology that we want that benefits workers. So it's a political struggle. I think this is fundamental to building any better world, is that the liberation of free time is not going to happen necessarily. It's not going to happen automatically. It's a political struggle. So that is, that runs through everything that we're talking about. I know what your first part of your question was. I was going to.
Oh, that the workers don't like that.
Oh yeah, they don't like data. Yeah, so this is a really interesting thing. So I come from Canada, where there's not much class identity. There's not much sense of being part of the working class. It's very much like America, where everybody thinks that they're part of the working middle class, rather. And it's just a sort of bland thing that doesn't think about class. Coming to the UK, it was quite different for me. So there's a much bigger sense of class identity here. There's a very strong sense of being part of the working class, still to this day. And like you mentioned, in Japan and in other countries, there's a lot of emphasis placed on being hard workers. So how can you go to these people and say, we're going to get rid of all this work? The way I've started to frame it is it's not ending work, but it's expanding free time. Now, what comes about in that shift is that suddenly it's not a matter of being forced to do something, instead it's a matter of your choices over how you use your time is expanding. So if you wanted to work longer, you could continue to work longer. But, you get paid overtime, you get paid all these other sorts of things. And if you instead wanted to spend your free time, say you get a 3-day weekend, and you want to spend Friday doing something besides work, you can go and do that. So I think the fight for free time, rather than the fight against work, is a better way to frame this stuff. And it seems to be, when I talk with people about it, it seems to go down much better.
So that's kind of a critique against all left or all the Keynesian idea that workers work is working workers are good people, the social democratic ideas of how full employment and people. Also, like recently, David Graeber kind of criticized this idea of the working ethics.
Yeah. So there's a very good point made by the Endnotes Collective about the ways in which, if we want to surpass capitalism and we want to get a classless society, you have to get rid of class. And so there becomes this tension within the working class about the working class takes on an identity, but the political project is to actually abolish that identity. So the working class is trying to eliminate the category of the working class. And this gets played out in all sorts of tensions across the 20th century. Crucially, you get a sort of division between some on the left who want to valorize working class identity as a great thing, and communism becomes this thing where it's just, working class culture spread around everywhere. And that becomes a very worker-centric version of what communism would look like, and it becomes, for me, tied to this idea of wage labor. It adopts all these capitalist values and capitalist ideas about how we should organize society, and it accepts them. Whereas I think, actually, we do have to abolish the working class as a category. We have to abolish wage labor as a social form. And that is a much different project for what communism means. Let me make one other distinction here as well, which is wage labor does not encompass all of work. So there's work outside of wage labor. Wage labor is the way in which work is organized under capitalism, but we can imagine alternative ways of organizing the work that's necessary to be done. And crucially, that's what we're trying to argue for, is the end of wage labor, not the end of work. This gets into the idea of what post-capitalism is again, because capitalism, when you analyze it, is built upon a few basic components, and one of those crucial components is wage labor and labor markets as a form. So wage labor and labor markets, they end up driving the search for productivity, they end up compelling people to be dependent on markets, and they end up driving the search for profits on an aggregate level. So wage labor, if we can attack wage labor as this core component of capitalism, strategically speaking, that seems like an incredibly powerful political project. Now, I don't think that means if we got rid of wage labor, we would be in post-capitalism. I think we'd still have capitalism, but it would be a much different version of capitalism, and crucially important, it would be a capitalism in which the proletariat had a much stronger role. So a much stronger position. It would no longer be dependent on labor markets, no longer dependent on wage labor for its livelihood. So I think it's a political project which is trying to aim towards communism, but to do so step by step by step. I think the first step is attack wage labor.
Okay. So, but in any case, the expanding the free time is very key component of the project of post-capitalism. So with this idea of the expanding free time based on the further technological development, we are often categorized as we do the left accelerationist.
Yeah.
So is it correct to say that we can overcome capitalism, or at least neoliberal capitalism, by accelerating something or accelerating technology? Or like, what should we accelerate? How should we accelerate?
So this is the crucial question about accelerationism. What is being accelerated? And I think there's a whole ton of confusions about accelerationism because everybody sort of reads that term and they think a ton of different things are being accelerated. So for us, it's a matter of accelerating and trying to build the material conditions for communism. And this means accelerating technological development, but not in a capitalist sense. Because capitalism is driven to change technology in order to increase productivity towards greater output and greater extraction of surplus value fundamentally. But that's a recipe essentially for ecological catastrophe, for perpetual crises. So when we're talking about accelerating technology, it's accelerating technology towards a communist vision about what that technology would look like. And this fundamentally does mean that we need some sort of democratic control over technology. And this democracy, not just at the national level, it's democracy from the lowest levels up to the highest levels. So one of my favorite examples of this sort of thing is the Lucas plant in the 1970s. So Lucas Aerospace was a major weapons manufacturer in the 1970s here in the UK. And basically, in the 1970s, they were facing massive layoffs. And so what happened was that the workers decided, through their own initiative, that if we're not going to be building weapons and therefore we're going to have to lay off people, what if we use the existing technology in these factories that we have and the existing skills that the workers had to build other things? And what they came up with was the Lucas Plan, which was to reorient all of that technological infrastructure towards building not weapons, but instead what they call social use for goods. So these were things like renewable technology. They were, one of my favorite examples was a heating unit for collective housing. It wasn't for individual housing. They were already thinking, well, what we want is collective housing, and we'll build the material infrastructure that enables that sort of thing to happen. And this, I think, was a moment of real worker democracy over the development of technology. And it ended up failing because of the struggle between workers and management. Management ended up getting beating them and beating the workers. But it shows what I think could happen, and the sort of thing that we should be aiming for today is thinking about, well, we have, fantastic technological potential everywhere. It's often channeled towards entirely destructive things and profit-oriented things, but we can use that technology and reimagine how it could be used.
So you're not saying actually that we should accelerate everything. You actually have a specific.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah. And I think so. This goes to the heart of this term accelerationism is, I think, very problematic, and I tend not to use it anymore.
Really?
Precisely because it leads to these sorts of things of like, you want to speed up everything.
Yeah.
And then the obvious question is, well, aren't things going fast enough already? And our point would be, well, of course things are going fast. We want to slow things down. We want more free time to do what you want to do. So I think accelerationism as a term leads to a lot of misconceptions.
Because recently accelerationism is also partly discussed in Japan, but people often talk about more like a right-wing version of it, like reactionary, especially the Nick Land. His article got just translated into Japanese, and then the idea of dark enlightenment or neo-cameralist CEO kind of thing is often discussed. So, how do you view them, first of all? Because you were both. Some people think that both of you guys are accelerationists. It's just the difference of right and left.
Yeah, exactly. And again, so I think again this is where the term sort of breaks down, because I don't fundamentally see a lot of commonalities between our projects. I think you could trace it back to a commonality in Deleuze. So Gilles Deleuze's work was massively influential on me when I was an undergrad and a master's student, and his thinking still inflects a lot of what I do nowadays. And Nick Land was very much a Deleuzian who read Anti-Oedipus and decided that Anti-Oedipus's calls for absolute deterritorialization were the way to go, which even Deleuze and Guattari, in 1,000 Plateaus, said Anti-Oedipus was too much. And they sort of backed away from that stage. Whereas Nick Land says, no, that is the way to go. But I think here's what fundamentally his project is all about, is that he sees capital as the only subject. So there are no human subjects. The idea, there's an illusion of subjectivity, but fundamentally capitalism, or capital, is the subject. And it is being played out, accelerating, it's destroying all sorts of territorializations, all sorts of identities, all sorts of subjectivities. And his project is to continue that process. So he ultimately sees the end point as the complete abolition of subjectivity and complete abolition of any sort of idea of human agency or subjectivity whatsoever. Whereas I think that's fundamentally wrong. I think that capitalism is a fundamental territorialization. It deterritorializes on the one hand, which is, this is Deleuze and Guattari's point, but then it reterritorializes in terms of profit, in terms of wage labor, in terms of constraining human potential, forming people as proletarian subjects rather than anything else. I think fundamentally capitalism is an extremely limiting social system. So this is where I think, actually, Nick Land is he's obviously reactionary, but this is where he's fundamentally limited, is that he thinks capitalism is the most deterritorialized system, when in fact it's highly rigid and limited.
So when the capitalism itself is already limiting, or like a limiting system, we cannot overcome it by accelerating capitalism in sense. Is that? So
Land doesn't want to go beyond capitalism in any way. He wants to fulfill capitalism. And so it's the other thing. So in many ways, 1990s Nick Land is all about this project. And then he disappears for, 10, 15 years, something like that. Moves to China, and then he comes back. And he comes back in an aggressively racist form, in an aggressively reactionary form. And I think there's in many ways, I think there's a parallel between his project and the way he's turned out, and these sort of problems of the left in the early 20th century, which was the prediction that this revolution is going to happen. So for the left, it's, this communist revolution is going to happen. Capitalism is making everything worse. People are going to rise up and we're going to have communism. And then that doesn't happen. For Nick Land, it's capitalism is going to take over in the 1990s. We're going to have hyper-globalization. We're going to have the end of all borders and everything, the abolition of all these territorial structures. And then in the 2000s, that doesn't happen. Now, both of those programs are left with the fundamental question of why didn't our revolution happen? And I think, in many ways, Nick Land's project today can be read as him trying to respond to what went wrong and trying to build a project to go back to that 90s goal of hyperglobalization, but doing so in a way which is just utterly reactionary, utterly racist, and fundamentally elitist.
So you don't even support the idea of hyperglobalization?
So I'm against borders, and the free movement of people, I think, is fundamental to any long-term goal of the left. But that's different from the free movement of capital, and that's different from the free movement of goods and services. So I think, there's an element of hyperglobalization which I can get on board with. And I think, the nation state, as an immigrant, I can see every single, I can see many aspects of the nation state that are fundamentally appalling.
So, yeah, because now you kind of already distance yourself from accelerationism aside. I mean, at least you don't prefer to use it so often. But so you generally think that this dark enlightenment type of right-wing accelerationism has almost nothing to do with your version of left-wing accelerationism. There is some strict division.
Yeah, I see very few commonalities. Yeah. There's an interest in the historical progression of technology. There's an interest in the historical progression of capitalism. But that holds to a lot of different projects, not just accelerationism. So I struggle to see many commonalities at all.
Okay. Because you actually argue for more democratic control of technology and increasing free time for the sake of liberation of workers.
Yeah.
That sounds quite reasonable. Okay, so, but do you think that the technology alone automatically leads to post-capitalism? Who do you think that the subject is necessary unless we fall into some kind of techno-determinism? It's kind of disbelief. I think many people get attracted to the idea of accelerationism. It's maybe wrong version, but because it's easy, we don't have to do anything. Like the technology develops automatically, and the capitalism, and then if those technologies offer us or provide us with some solution for problems that we have, it's very happy that we don't have to go to demonstration, we don't have to fight on the workplace and so on. So, but do you agree with that type of the techno-deterministic idea, or do you actually argue for the necessity of posing certain subject? Is it working class? If so?
Yeah. So there's nothing automatic. Technology, as it is driven today, is dominated by capitalists. It's dominated by the imperatives of capitalism, and it will, if left to its own devices, without any sort of struggle, it will be absolutely appalling. In a sort of worst case scenario, we'll have tons of people thrown out of work and left to fend for themselves on the margins of society. It's just, there's nothing automatically good that will emerge from technology. So it is fundamentally a struggle. This includes workplace struggles. It can include protests. It can include electoral politics. It can include riots. It can include building alternative systems within the existing system. I think, so let me say for a moment, going back to strategy, I think that there's one of the problems with the left is that oftentimes they sort of think that there's one single organizational form which will solve all of our problems. So if we just get, cooperatives, or if we just get, strong unions, or if we get the right political party, therefore everything will sort of work its way to a better situation. I think fundamentally we need to get beyond that monocausal approach, and we need to think about ecosystems of organizations. So the way in which political parties can do certain things which are incredibly beneficial that, say, a social movement can't, that a union can't. But likewise, unions and social movements and communes and all these other things can do things that the political parties can't. Now, there's a book by a guy called Graham Jones. It's called The Shock Doctrine of the Left. And I think he sets out in a really nice way, really clear way, what the sort of, how these things will sort of work together. So he doesn't see any one organization doing everything. He sees 4 different sorts of functions of this ecosystem of different organizations. And these are the idea of smashing things. So this is, traditional sort of black bloc tactics, rioting, moments where there's mass protests. Smashing things essentially creates a moment of openness. So the idea that the existing order doesn't have to be this way, that it could be something different. And his idea is that, we use these moments not just to destroy things, but also to build support for a larger political project. He also says, we need not just smashing, we need building. So we need to be building the alternatives as we go along. So this can be building communes, it can be building cooperatives, it can be building commons-based institutions, it can be building all sorts of things which are precursors to the sort of system that we would eventually want. Now, of course, they're not sufficient on their own because they get swallowed up by capitalism. So you also need things like healing, which is maintaining the movement. So in long periods where there may be a low ebb in struggle, how do you maintain the movement through that time? And this involves healing. It can be, the sort of emotional labor that's necessary for keeping people going, but it can also be basic, food bank type stuff, feeding people, providing people with housing, giving people the support so that when the next moment of openness arises, those people are available to, struggle for something different. So we've got smashing, building, healing, and then there's taming, which is where sort of party politics comes in. This idea that we can at least get rid of some of the worst excesses of the existing system. So if people are struggling in their day-to-day lives to try and make things work, and they're struggling to make ends meet, they don't have any time left for politics. So taming the current system and allowing people to be able to do some political action is a crucially important part. But again, none of these 4 things are sufficient on their own. But Graham Jones sets out how they can all sort of work together, a meta strategy, and then thinking about how different organizations fit into all of that.
How do you, is it if you still say that the working class exists and then they are the ones that carries out this transition?
Yeah, so
people like from the post-colonialism or people like Negri would say that the working class doesn't exist anymore. We are all living in the social factory or something. Yeah. And, people associate that kind of idea with your work because, like Mason always about individual rights, socialized individuals, or network individuals. Many people think that you always do the same thing.
Yeah, so we're very much influenced by Negri and Hart and the whole Italian autonomia. But there is, I think, a fundamental difference on a couple questions. One of these is the question of where and how value is produced. So I would say I'm probably much more orthodox and Marxist on this sort of question. I think that value can be produced outside of the workplace, but it's not. The problem with a lot of autonomia is that it ends up being value is produced everywhere. And like you say, you get the social factory idea. I don't think that is right. I think there is still some essential divisions between where value is produced and where it's not produced, what tasks produce value and what tasks don't. So there's that sort of fundamental question. Then there's the question of, well, what is the subject? So if the social factory doesn't exist as they say, there is still a working class, but again, this hinges on what we mean by the working class. So I take Marx's sort of core definition of the proletariat, which is the proletariat is that who depends on wage labor. And this can include every single worker who relies upon wage labor for their income, but it also includes unemployed people who are still dependent on wage labor, even though they're not actually involved in it. So the proletariat there is suddenly a huge group of people. And this includes, cognitive workers. It doesn't have to be a factory worker. It can be all the service workers that have risen up in deindustrialized countries. And then, crucially, after the fall of the USSR and the emergence of China into global capitalism, you end up getting a doubling of the global proletariat. So it goes from, the estimates are 1.6 billion people reliant on wage labor in the late 80s, and then by the mid-90s, it's 3.2 billion people who are dependent on wage labor. So if anything, I think the idea of the proletariat is more relevant today than it ever has been before. There's a greater proportion of the population, the global population, that are proletariat than ever before. So I think that that's the crucial thing. But then, fundamentally, there's internal differences within that class system. So there's all the national differences, there's racial differences, there's sexual and gender differences, there's all these sorts of things which don't need to be overcome, but they need to be recognized. And this is where I find Ernesto Laclau's work really useful, is that his project is built towards, if you have a system of differences, how do you cohere them into a coherent political subject and a coherent political project? And I think that's the fundamental question for today, is that we have this sort of basic class identity, but it's not sufficient for mobilizing people. It's not sufficient to respond to people's interests as well. So how do we build that collective political subject? So it goes against some readings of Laclau, because I think Laclau is actually very useful to a class-based system, a class-based project. But it's...
Maybe some Laclauian would say that he used to privileges the class dimension for the economy.
Yeah.
And especially this idea of post-capitalism only responds to some problems in capitalism, but not the issues of gender, race, and ethnicity.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I think that it needs to be recognized at every step of the way that this is only one political project of many necessary political projects. And there's feminist aspects to this, there's anti-racist aspects to this project, there's anti-xenophobe aspects to this project, but the project for post-capitalism is not going to solve all of our problems.
Okay, so it's kind of limited to the economic program.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's limited to that, but let's say it's focused on that, rather than limited. Because I think, as part of that project would be the gender division of labor. So if we can get rid of the gender division of labor, that obviously has it solves some of the issues involved in feminism, but it's not going to solve all the issues. I think they go beyond just the division of labor.
So post-capitalism would abolish this gender division of labor, because if men also have more free time, they would take care of babies and so on.
Yeah, and also recognizing the ways in which we can reduce the amount of work involved in social reproduction.
And the care labor will be also valued more.
Yes, yeah.
Because I think one of the important dimensions is that the more automation, and you don't have much workers in working factories, and people still have difficulty replacing care workers with robots and machines. So these currently low paid and low evaluated care laborers will have more importance in the future society.
I think so as well. So my wife, Helen Hester, and I were writing a book on this topic, actually. So you get the situation where people who talk about post-work don't often talk about social reproduction work. So they talk about the work of, being done in the office, being done in a factory, and that work is going to be automated. But very few people talk about the automation, or not the automation, but the reduction of social reproduction work. And then you have feminists who come along and they say, well, quite rightly, you've missed this whole massive group of work that's being done predominantly by women. So what are you going to do about that? But there's this weird thing where feminists oftentimes, and there's a few exceptions, but oftentimes they accept social reproduction as the limit of post-work. So we can apply post-work to sort of normal productive work, but social reproductive work is just sort of fundamentally unchangeable in terms of reducing the amount of work. Now, our book is arguing for, actually, we can apply post-work principles to social reproduction. The challenge, the immediate challenge at least, is that it can't mostly be automated. So if you can't just have robots do all this care work, what does it mean to reduce the work?
Right.
So our book is all about how you do that sort of thing.
Because I don't want my son to be taught by robots.
Yeah. But so that being said, how many people put their children in front of an iPad or a television? This is the automation of childcare already, but we just don't think of it that way. So I think actually there is a lot of automation of social reproduction going on right now. The question again is, how do we ensure that it's done in a way which benefits people rather than just becomes a sort of, plopping your kid in front of the television for 6 hours a day or something.
Because that already has negative.
Exactly, yeah. So the question is, how do we use technology in a way which can achieve the goals that we want? Fully flourishing individuals and a reduction of the time as well. One thing I will say, so oftentimes there's an instinctual reaction against the idea of automating care work. When Helen and I have gone and talked to care workers, though, people who do it for a living, they're the ones who are more supportive of automation than anybody else. And in part it's because when you talk to these workers, they see aspects of their jobs that could be automated. So I'll give a simple example, which is an elderly care worker that we talked to who was going on about how the sorting and distribution of medicine every single day could be something which is easily automated and would save them a lot of time. It would enable them to then go and spend more time doing humane things. So I think we shouldn't instinctually be against all automation of care work. We need to think about different nuances involved in that idea.
So you still try to accelerate many things.
To some degree, yeah.
So I think that the one thing that I don't think personally should be accelerated is especially in terms of ecology, because I think that the problem currently that we have is that we have already accelerated too much so that we destroy the entire planet. So if you can put some ecological aspects into this entire argument, I think there's another dimension. Should we really accelerate more, or shouldn't we actually de-accelerate, slow down, for the sake of our kids?
Yeah, I think the ecological question is absolutely crucial. Alex and I's book is called Inventing the Future, but of course to invent the future you have to actually have a future. So without that sort of basic level of ecological sustainability, all talk of the future is meaningless. So I think anybody who wants to talk about how we build post-capitalism, something beyond capitalism, has to be talking about as well these ecological issues. Now it doesn't get discussed in our book, largely because we thought it was too serious to put into a single chapter in the book. So we had a bunch of stuff written for a chapter in Inventing the Future, and then we just decided that it was too big of an issue to cover in one chapter. But it is something which is missing from that book and absolutely crucial to be thinking about at the same time. So this question of have we accelerated too much, I think it goes to, again, the meaning of what is being accelerated. What we're really talking about here is the expansion of carbon emissions crucially. There's other emissions as well, but it's carbon emissions which are most important. And that is premised upon economic growth, but economic growth means growth in GDP, which is an extremely poor measure of economic growth, let alone any sort of meaningful human growth. And I think that it's not surprising that that's what capitalism is aiming for. but the idea of accelerating isn't to continue that process. And I think in many ways we can argue that capitalism is a fundamentally repetitive system. So what it does is that it constantly reproduces its own conditions. So it reproduces wage labor, it reproduces a capitalist class, it reproduces all these systems which are oriented towards generating more and more value and accumulating more and more value without end. And fundamentally, that is a system which isn't controlled by anybody. So this is, I think, this is what we want to eliminate. This is what we want to get away from. And that means some sort of control over the economy. So when we talk about accelerating, it's not continuing that process. It's fundamentally saying, this process is driving us to catastrophe. We need to change that entirely.
So it's not, is it creating destruction? Is it?
I have
People think so, but it's not.
Is capitalism creative destruction?
Not that we like accelerate and then sort of accelerating to the extent that the system sort of gets destroyed.
Yeah, that's the other really, I think I would say bad interpretation of what accelerationism is. This idea that basically accelerate the contradictions, which there are some people on the left who have made that case before.
Or even like Communist Manifesto, some people think reading that way.
To some degree, but so accelerating the contradictions in practice would mean things like arguing for the end of the NHS and arguing for the end of minimum wage laws. And I think, there are sort of groups on the left who are against any amelioration by the state of the excesses of capitalism. So you see this argument around UBI, for instance, the idea that UBI will be a way to buy off workers and keep them supporting capitalism. I think the logic of that argument is incredibly destructive. It basically says we can't help workers because then they might still like capitalism. And that actually we have to make things worse so that they hate capitalism. And that for me is incredibly a cynical way to approach building up worker power. I think the question isn't getting people to hate capitalism. The question is how do we give people power to build a better system? So if taking away healthcare is a way to so I think, this idea of accelerationism being about accelerating the contradictions is fundamentally wrong. That's not what we're talking about at all. Again, this is one of the reasons why I think accelerationism as a term is such a bad term, because it leads to all these different misreadings.
But on the other hand, even if, that type of accelerationism is bad, and also the GDP doesn't really reflect the growth in our human potentiality and so on, you also don't accept the idea of degrowth.
Yeah.
It's not about going back to, for the ecology, we should maybe simply give up.
So degrowth. It deserves, I think, a proper engagement with at some point, because I think it raises a lot of interesting questions, and I think it poses the questions in very stark ways which are useful. But so here's partly the challenge, I think, of degrowth is, let's say degrowth is taking the absolute state of global GDP as it exists today and just saying, that's it. We're not going to grow any further than that. That means fundamentally a reduction in the living standards of a huge number of people. It means effectively mass austerity for a large group of people. I think it also, it is premised still on this idea of GDP being a meaningful measure, which when you get into it, nobody actually thinks that. So I think this idea of using a terrible measure to then monitor our development is a bad way of going about things. I think what we need is not degrowth, but a different type of growth. And as to what that exactly means in practice, I think is up for a lot of debate and discussion. But I think degrowth in practice leads to that problem, and it's based upon a fundamental error. But then there's also my philosophical problem with it, which is that fundamentally humans are about development, progress, change, liberation. And I think degrowth philosophically is opposed to all of those things. So there's that fundamental philosophical difference. I think human liberation, human potential has plenty of room to grow. It may not be GDP growth, but there is still room for growth, and there's still room for technological change, and there's still room for thinking about different ways of liberating humanity. And for me, that's all about progress, development, growth, not about stasis.
Yeah, now one thing that you defend in your book is that enlightenment, like the modern idea of universality, emancipation, and progress, and so on. That was very interesting to read after many postmodernists rejected that type of idea, like post-colonial studies and so on. But on the other hand, in terms of nature, the modern idea of domination of nature was quite problematic. It created also the justification for the capitalist domination of nature. And we come from Japan, where the nuclear power plants are built, and then they exploded after the earthquake.
Yeah.
So, should we actually accelerate even those technologies? Everything, you said that not everything should be accelerated, but how do we distinguish good and bad technology? Should we accelerate, for example, the nuclear power plants? Is it because we had this incident because we didn't have enough productive forces to control the plant, or are there bad technologies by nature?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So on this mastery of nature thing, I think that fundamentally there is no separation between humanity and nature. I think it's one system. So there's no position from which you could master nature. I think it's entirely an illusion. The other aspect as well is that, at least since the 19th century, we've been well aware that nature is an unpredictable system. It's a chaotic, complex system. It's not controllable. So the mastery of nature has always been an illusion. And I think that's a fundamental premise. And when we start talking about things like geoengineering and things about impacting on climate change, is that we can't master nature. So that has to be the basis for any discussion around that stuff. In terms of this issue around what technologies to accelerate, I think it's a really, really good question. I think there are no sort of general principles that we can use. It's a matter of thinking about the case-by-case sort of thing. So let me give one example here, which is comes from Jasper Burns's work. And he argues about global logistics. He says that would global logistics, this massive infrastructural system that we've built up over the entire Earth, would that exist under communism? And his argument is no, because global logistics is fundamentally based upon the exploitation of wage differentials. So we build things into China because it's cheap labor, and then we ship them off to the rest of the world. Under communism, that wouldn't exist. And so therefore, the very conditions for that global logistics system wouldn't exist as well. So I think we can sort of look case by case at things like that and say, well, we don't want this technology because it's premised upon a fundamentally exploitative relationship. I think, yeah, it goes sort of technology by technology. I have to say, on nuclear power, I'm agnostic. I think the challenges of responding to climate change are so immense, are so difficult, and the politics of getting anything to happen are so incredibly, there's so many hurdles involved, that I think some really unpalatable solutions may be necessary just to save us from catastrophe. Mm-hmm. And it's not to advocate any of these things, but it's just to say that maybe these things might end up becoming necessary.
You include the geoengineering?
Yeah, I'm not going to advocate geoengineering, but I think that we do need to be giving consideration to, if it does happen, how do we have global control over it? So it's not just, for instance, one country deciding to go rogue and decide to introduce sulfates into the atmosphere or anything like that. But instead, it's a global system which has some sort of global governance mechanism involved. I think we need to be at least asking and answering, trying to answer those questions, because I think the situation is going to be forced where it may happen, and without a good solution, it's going to be even worse.
Because then you sort of depend still the ideas of being able to control nature.
Well, it's not control nature, but it's to intervene, which is still always possible. And that's why I think geoengineering is not a great idea, is because we don't necessarily know all the consequences of these sorts of things. Or there's this sort of nightmare scenario that I read about, which is let's put sulfates into the atmosphere, we'll cool down our environment, but then you have to keep pumping those sulfates into the atmosphere. And what happens if, let's say we have a world war or something like that, and people stop introducing those sulfates, suddenly you get rapid heating, and you get a much worse scenario than what we have today. So I think there's all sorts of problems with geoengineering, precisely because we can't master nature. And it's not an ideal situation in any way, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be thinking about, if it happens, how do we manage it in the best way possible?
Like my personal concern is that if we kind of hope for these new technology being able to solve maybe or react to these problems, otherwise we don't have to do anything. We can wait, like some smart people come up with these technologies.
Yeah.
So that the danger of like people like Bruno Latour or like the eco-modernists, they sort of argue for this idea of new technology that might be necessary. Even they claim that that might be bad, but we have to love our monsters we have created, so we cannot abandon them. But the problem is they function as a sort of ideology, like opium for us, not seeing the reality instead of changing something about what we have created.
Yeah, I think it's a real risk. You get this techno-solutionism, which just thinks we don't need to change our fundamental economic system whatsoever. We can just get new technologies to fix it all, which is essentially what the mainstream opinion is all about. Whether you look at Europe, China, America, America even denies that it's happening. It's fundamentally about, well, technology will save things, and a few market switches will, enable people to have the right incentives to solve climate change. And that's fundamentally wrong, of course. But I don't think it's the belief in techno-solutionism which is holding back progress on climate change. And I think, the opposite thing of saying, well, technology won't help us at all, that doesn't help us either. So we can't have techno-solutionism where technology will solve everything, but we can't have technological pessimism where technology will do nothing. We need to be thinking about both at the same sort of time.
We don't simply go back to the pre-technological age.
No, not without like massive destruction of humanity. Yeah. Sounds good. Yeah.
Very good.
Very interesting, huh? What?
Very interesting.
Yeah, I'm very excited. So,
He's more traditional than I thought. He's close to the Marxism that I endorse. Maybe can ask something.
I'm good, thanks. Yeah, I think I tried to be quite orthodox Marxist in many ways, but without necessarily using the terminology, because I think there's a lot of Marxism which writes for other Marxists, and that can make sense in certain contexts, but I think, Inventing the Future and Platform Capitalism were meant to be much broader books than just writing for Marxists. But at some point, I want to write a very orthodox Marxist book.
Is Alex sort of similar to?
Yeah, we're frighteningly similar on a lot of these positions, which is why I made writing the book fairly easy.
Are you guys still collaborating?
We're both doing our own independent projects at the moment. So he's writing two books actually on hegemony, So yeah, he's busy with those, and I'm writing this book with Helen, and then I've got another sort of book idea in mind as well.
Is he also in London?
He lives in London. He teaches at University of East Anglia, which is sort of, I think it's a 2-hour drive from London, or a 2-hour train ride or something like that. Yeah.
Not that close.
No, not too close.
Shall we turn off?
Oh.